The Boeing 737 trembled through turbulence at 37,000 feet, its 212 passengers unaware that death was climbing toward them from below. In seat 14C, Captain Thea, Revenant, Kowalski closed her copy of Advanced Aerodynamics, the textbook spine worn smooth from countless flights between her civilian job and weekend reserve duties. She'd chosen the window seat deliberately, old habits from a cockpit where situational awareness meant survival. The sky outside was deceptively peaceful, a canvas of deep azure punctuated by cotton-white clouds that reminded her of flak bursts over Kandahar. The first sign of trouble wasn't an explosion or alarm. It was silence, the kind of absolute quiet that every combat veteran recognizes as the moment before hell breaks loose. The commercial pilot's voice had been steady just moments before, updating passengers about their descent into Chicago O'Hare. Now, nothing. The cabin crew exchanged glances that passengers missed, but Thea caught immediately, trained eyes reading body language like tactical briefings. Then the radio crackled to life with a transmission that made Thea's blood freeze. American 447, you are being shadowed by unidentified military aircraft. Confirm nature of escort. The pilot's response came tight with controlled panic. Tower, negative on escort request. We show no military traffic on scope. American 447, we have visual confirmation of 2 F-22 Raptors on your 6. They are not responding to our frequencies. Thea's fingers instinctively moved to where her flight suit's radio would be, finding only the soft cotton of her civilian clothes. Through the small oval window, she caught it, a flash of metallic gray cutting through the cloud layer below. The angular silhouette was unmistakable, an F-22 Raptor, America's most lethal air superiority fighter. But something was wrong with its flight pattern, the aggressive positioning that spoke of intercept rather than escort. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking, the pilot's voice returned, unnaturally calm. We're experiencing some minor navigation issues and will be adjusting our approach. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Navigation issues. Thea almost smiled at the euphemism. She'd used similar language herself when explaining to ground control why her A-10 Thunderbolt was returning with half its tail section missing and an unconscious co-pilot. The art of keeping civilians calm while managing catastrophe was something they taught in survival school, but some pilots learned it under fire in places where GPS coordinates meant the difference between going home and becoming a memorial plaque. The second F-22 appeared in her peripheral vision, closer now. Close enough that she could see the pilot's helmet in the canopy. Close enough to see that the aircraft bore no identifying markings whatsoever. The woman in 14C reached for the flight attendant call button, then hesitated. In 60 seconds, her quiet Tuesday afternoon had transformed into something that felt disturbingly familiar, the kind of tactical situation that had earned her 3 distinguished flying crosses and a reputation for bringing impossible missions home. Captain Kowalski had been retired from active combat duty for 8 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. She'd thought those numbers mattered. She'd been wrong. The radio crackled again. American 447 confirmed the combat pilot on board. Every head in the cabin turned toward the flight attendant, but Thea's eyes remained fixed on the window. Someone knew she was here. Someone had been tracking her movements, her flight reservations, her seat assignment. The methodical precision of the intercept told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't random. This was personal. Her call sign, Revenant, had been earned over the Hindu Kush Mountains when she brought home a crippled F-16 with no hydraulics, no ejection seat, and a fire in the engine bay. The squadron had started calling her that after she'd walked away from crashes that should have killed her, like death itself couldn't quite finish the job. Now, suspended between earth and heaven at 7 miles high, she wondered if her luck had finally run out. The flight attendant approached her row, coffee pot trembling slightly in manicured hands. "Ma'am, is everything all right? You look concerned." Thea met her eyes and saw fear there, the kind that civilians experience when their ordered world suddenly reveals its fragility. "I'm fine," she said quietly, then added words that tasted like brass and gunpowder. but you might want to prepare the cabin for an emergency landing. Outside, the F-22s adjusted their formation, moving into what Thea recognized as an aggressive intercept pattern. Someone down there was calling the shots, someone who knew her service record, her capabilities, and exactly how to flush a veteran pilot out of retirement. The question that gnawed at her wasn't who, it was why. The radio transmission had been clear. They weren't just tracking American 447. They were tracking her specifically. After 18 years of military service, 12 combat deployments, and a classified mission record that she'd never discuss even under oath, Captain Thea Kowalski had believed her war was over. She'd been spectacularly wrong. The Boeing shuddered as it began an unscheduled descent, and through the window, Thea watched the F-22's close formation like wolves moving in for the kill. Whatever was happening, whoever was orchestrating this aerial chess matched 37,000 feet above the American Midwest. They had just made a critical error in judgment. They'd assumed she was still just a passenger. Major Alina Vasquez pressed her headset tighter against her ears, trying to filter out the controlled chaos of the command center buried 300 feet beneath Cheyenne Mountain. 24 screens flickered with satellite imagery, radar signatures, and encrypted communication feeds that painted a real-time picture of the crisis unfolding over American airspace. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, but she couldn't remember when she'd last taken a sip. "Ma'am, we have confirmation," Technical Sergeant Morrison reported from his station, fingers dancing across holographic displays that would have seemed like science fiction just 5 years earlier. "Target acquired. American Airlines Flight 447, Boeing 737-800, currently at 34,000 feet and descending. The package is aboard." Vasquez studied the tactical display with the cold precision that had earned her the Pentagon's confidence in situations that officially didn't exist. The F-22s showed as blue diamonds on her screen, their pilots selected from a roster of men and women whose psychological profiles suggested they could follow orders without asking inconvenient questions. Sometimes the most dangerous missions required the most unthinking obedience. "Status on our intercept pilots?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus, Blade, Harrison, and Captain Sophia, Ice, Petrov were among the Air Force's most skilled aviators, and more importantly, they were patriots who understood that some threats to national security wore friendly uniforms. "Both aircraft report ready for final phase," Morrison replied. "They're maintaining visual contact with the target. Passenger aircraft is complying with descent orders." On the main screen, a satellite feed showed the 3 aircraft as tiny specks against the patchwork farmland of Illinois. To any observer, it might look like a routine military escort, the kind of precautionary measure that had become commonplace since 9/11. But Vasquez knew better. This operation had been 18 months in planning, triggered by intelligence reports that had landed on her desk with classification levels that made her security clearance feel inadequate. The woman in seat 14C represented something more dangerous than any terrorist with a bomb. She represented memory. And in a world where certain operations needed to remain buried, memory could be the most devastating weapon of all. "Major, we're receiving encrypted communication from one of our intercept pilots." Morrison's voice carried a note of confusion. "It's unusual." Vasquez moved to his station, reading the text that scrolled across his secure terminal. The message was brief, professional, and absolutely impossible. "Command, this is Blade Leader. Target aircraft pilot REQESDS direct communication with tactical commander. Claims knowledge of Operation Nightfall. Repeat, civilian CLAIMS knowledge of Nightfall. Advise." The command center fell silent except for the hum of servers and the distant whisper of air recycling systems. Operation Nightfall had been classified at levels that required presidential authorization to discuss. The after-action reports had been sealed, the participants reassigned to different commands, and the mission itself officially designated as never having occurred. Only 12 people in the entire United States military knew about Operation Nightfall. 11 of them were in this room or positions of strategic command. The 12th was supposed to be dead. Ma'am, Morrison prompted, his young face reflecting the confusion that Vasquez felt but couldn't afford to show. She stared at the tactical display, watching the blue diamonds that represented American air power closing on a commercial aircraft that should have contained nothing more threatening than business travelers and soccer moms. Instead, it carried a ghost from an operation that had officially never happened, piloted by someone who had seen too much to be allowed to simply fly away into a comfortable retirement. "Patch me through to Blade Leader," Vasquez ordered, her voice steady despite the implications racing through her mind. "Priority channel, full encryption." As the communication systems connected her to the F-22 pilot 34,000 feet above the American heartland, Major Elena Vasquez found herself hoping that the intelligence reports had been wrong. Because if Captain Thea Kowalski really was alive, really was aboard that aircraft, and really did remember Operation Nightfall, then this mission had just evolved from containment to something far more complicated. And far more dangerous. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus, Blade, Harrison felt the familiar weight of the F-22's controls beneath his gloved hands, the aircraft responding to his thoughts as much as his movements after 15 years of flying the most advanced fighter jet ever created. At 40,000 feet, the world below looked peaceful, ordered, manageable, a dangerous illusion that every combat pilot learned to distrust. Today's mission brief had been unusually sparse, heavy on operational security and light on context, which usually meant someone wearing stars on their collar had deemed the details too sensitive for field commanders. "Ice 2, maintain formation bearing," he transmitted to his wingman, Captain Sofia Petrov, whose F-22 held position 300 meters off his starboard wing. Sofia was one of the few pilots he trusted absolutely, a woman who'd earned her call sign not from emotional coldness, but from her ability to remain analytically precise under extreme pressure. If she was concerned about today's mission parameters, she hadn't voiced it over the radio. The Boeing 737 filled his heads-up display, its civilian markings and routine flight path a stark contrast to the military precision of their intercept. Harrison had escorted dozens of commercial aircraft during his career, usually during heightened security alerts or when intelligence suggested potential threats. This felt different. The mission orders had come directly from Cheyenne Mountain, with instructions that allowed for no deviation, no improvisation, and absolutely no communication with the target aircraft beyond essential traffic control. "Blade Leader, this is command." Major Vasquez's voice came through his encrypted headset with the kind of digital clarity that meant serious people were listening to every word. "What's your current status on target?" "Target acquired and maintaining intercept formation," Harrison replied, watching the 737's altitude indicator on his tactical display. "Commercial aircraft is complying with descent orders. No unusual activity observed." There was a pause that lasted just long enough to suggest consultation with higher authority. "Blade Leader, we have a development. The target aircraft is requesting direct communication with tactical command. Maintain intercept, but do not engage unless specifically ordered." Harrison's training told him to acknowledge the order and continue the mission without questions. His instincts, honed through combat deployments over Syria, Iraq, and places that didn't officially exist on military maps, told him something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. Commercial aircraft didn't request communication with tactical command unless someone aboard knew military protocol well enough to understand chain of command structures. "Command, clarify nature of communication request," he transmitted, his eyes tracking the 737's flight path as it continued its controlled descent toward what appeared to be a forced landing at an Air Force base that wasn't on their original flight plan. "Stand by, Blade Leader." Through his canopy, Harrison could see the civilian aircraft's passenger windows, tiny rectangles that might contain families returning from vacation, business travelers checking emails, elderly couples visiting grandchildren. Standard operating procedure said he shouldn't think about civilians as individuals. It complicated the mission mindset that kept military pilots effective under stress. But today, those windows seemed to hold secrets that his classification level wasn't high enough to understand. Captain Petrov's voice crackled through his headset on their discreet channel. "Marcus, something feels off about this intercept. Mission parameters are too restrictive for standard escort protocol." He keyed his radio for a response, then stopped. Sophia was right, but radio discipline meant keeping tactical observations to encrypted post-mission debriefings. Still, her comment reflected his own growing unease. 15 years of military aviation had taught him to trust the subtle wrongness that sometimes preceded combat situations, the feeling that intelligence briefings hadn't told the complete story. "ICE-2 maintains standard formation and monitor all frequencies," he replied, using language that sounded routine but carried an understood message. "Stay alert for developments that weren't in the mission brief." The 737 continued its descent through scattered cloud layers, its navigation lights blinking with mechanical regularity against the afternoon sky. Inside that aircraft was someone important enough to trigger a classified intercept mission, someone whose presence warranted two of America's most advanced fighters and operational security that extended to the highest levels of military command. Harrison adjusted his formation slightly, maintaining visual contact, while his radar painted a complete tactical picture of the airspace around them. Whatever was happening today, whoever was orchestrating this carefully choreographed encounter between military and civilian aviation had just elevated a routine Tuesday afternoon into something that felt suspiciously like the opening move of a much larger game. And in his experience, games that began with this level of secrecy rarely ended with everyone going home safely. Captain Sophia, ICE, Petrov maintained formation flight with the precision that had made her one of only 47 female F-22 pilots in the United States Air Force. Her call sign reflected not emotional detachment, but rather her ability to process tactical information with analytical clarity that remained unaffected by adrenaline, fear, or the kind of political pressure that sometimes influenced military operations. Today's mission had triggered every instinct she'd developed during her 7-year career, flying America's most lethal air-to-air combat aircraft. The Boeing 737 ahead of them flew steady and level, but Sophia's trained eyes caught subtle variations in its flight path, minor corrections that suggested either turbulence or a pilot dealing with stress-induced overcorrection. Through her helmet's advanced targeting system, she could observe the commercial aircraft in detail that would have been impossible just a generation earlier. 2 engines, standard wing configuration, passenger windows that reflected afternoon sunlight like a mirror hiding secrets. "ICE-2, this is command." Major Vasquez's voice carried the kind of controlled tension that Sophia recognized from pre-mission briefings during her deployment to the Persian Gulf. "Prepare to monitor civilian aircraft frequency. We may have direct communication with someone aboard the target." Sophia acknowledged the transmission while her mind processed implications. Direct communication between military command and civilian passengers wasn't standard protocol for aircraft intercepts. It suggested someone aboard the 737 possessed security clearance, tactical knowledge, or information significant enough to warrant deviation from established procedures. Her F-22's advanced avionics suite painted a complete electronic picture of the airspace around them. Commercial aviation frequencies, air traffic control communications, and the encrypted military channels that connected her to command created a symphony of voices managing the controlled complexity of modern flight. But beneath the routine traffic, Sophia detected something else: radio silence where there should have been chatter, gaps in communication that suggested operational security measures typically reserved for combat zones. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's F-22 maintained perfect formation off her port wing, his aircraft's angular stealth profile cutting through thin air with the efficient lethality that made the Raptor the most feared fighter jet in the world. Marcus was one of the few pilots she trusted completely, a commander whose tactical judgment had been proven through multiple combat deployments and classified operations that would never appear on official records. If he was concerned about today's mission parameters, His radio discipline prevented him from expressing those concerns over encrypted channels that command monitored continuously. The 737 began another gentle descent, following what appeared to be vectors toward Wright-Patterson Air Force Base rather than its original destination of Chicago O'Hare. Sophia's tactical display showed the course change as a deviation that required authorization from air traffic control, military command, and probably several levels of government oversight that her security clearance didn't encompass. "Blade leader, maintain current intercept formation," she transmitted on their discrete frequency. "I'm showing significant course deviation from original civilian flight plan." "Acknowledged, ICE 2, Harrison replied, his voice carrying subtexts that military pilots learned to read like tactical communications. "Stay alert. Trust your training. Be prepared for mission parameters to change without warning." Through her canopy, Sophia could see passenger windows along the 737's fuselage. Somewhere inside that aluminum tube flying at 32,000 feet was someone important enough to trigger a classified military response. Someone whose presence had mobilized resources, personnel, and operational security measures that suggested national security implications. Her weapons systems remained powered down, standard procedure for aircraft intercept missions over domestic airspace. But her targeting radar continued its automated scan, painting a complete tactical picture that could be transmitted to command in real time. The F-22's stealth capabilities meant the civilian aircraft's crew probably couldn't detect their presence on conventional radar, but visual contact at this range meant someone looking out a passenger window might see them. Sophia adjusted her formation position slightly, maintaining visual contact while staying within the mission parameters that had been briefed with unusual emphasis on operational security. Whatever was happening today, whoever had ordered this intercept, had just connected her to something that felt significantly more complex than routine aviation security. And in her experience, complexity in military operations usually meant someone was about to make decisions that would have consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Inside the Boeing 737's cabin, flight attendant Jennifer Walsh moved through the aisles with practiced calm, while her training screamed warnings about the subtle changes in aircraft behavior that passengers couldn't detect. 23 years of commercial aviation had taught her to read the signs, the slight variations in engine tone, the barely perceptible changes in cabin pressure, and most importantly, the controlled tension in the flight crew's voices over the intercom system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent," Captain Rodriguez announced, his words carrying professional confidence that didn't quite mask the stress Jennifer heard beneath them. "Please ensure your seat backs are in the upright position and tray tables are secured." The announcement was routine, but the timing wasn't. They should still be 90 minutes from Chicago O'Hare, flying over terrain that Jennifer recognized as central Illinois farmland, rather than the approaching urban sprawl that should mark their descent into one of America's busiest airports. Something had changed their flight plans significantly, and the passengers hadn't been informed. In seat 14C, the woman with the textbook caught Jennifer's attention. She'd been reading advanced aeronautical engineering materials throughout the flight, unusual for civilian passengers, but not unprecedented. What struck Jennifer as significant was the woman's reaction to the course changes. While other passengers remained absorbed in movies, magazines, or conversation, the woman in 14C was studying the landscape below with the focused attention of someone reading tactical information. "Excuse me," Jennifer approached her row with the coffee service cart that provided cover for closer observation. "Would you care for anything to drink?" The woman looked up, and Jennifer found herself meeting eyes that seemed familiar with stress, decision-making under pressure, and situations where details mattered. "Coffee would be fine, thank you." There was something in her voice, confidence, maybe, or the kind of calm that came from experience managing crisis situations. Jennifer poured coffee into a plastic cup, noticing that the woman's hands remained steady despite the aircraft's subtle vibrations that suggested course corrections. "Are you in aviation?" Jennifer asked quietly, using the conversational approach that sometimes helped nervous passengers relax during turbulence. "Former military," the woman replied, accepting the coffee with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I notice we're not following our original flight path." Jennifer felt her pulse quicken. Passengers rarely noticed navigation changes unless they possessed professional knowledge of aviation procedures. Sometimes air traffic control requests course adjustments for weather or traffic management. "Of course," the woman agreed, then added words that made Jennifer's breath catch. "Though we appear to be heading toward military airspace rather than commercial approach patterns." The cabin suddenly felt smaller, more fragile. Jennifer had served coffee and snacks to thousands of passengers during her career, but she'd never had a civilian accurately identify military flight vectors during what was supposed to be a routine domestic flight. The woman in 14C wasn't just a passenger. She was someone whose knowledge extended to areas that Jennifer's security training had taught her to report to flight crew immediately. "I'll need to check with the captain about our arrival time," Jennifer said, maintaining professional courtesy while her mind raced through protocols for unusual passenger behavior. "If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to call." As she moved toward the forward galley, Jennifer caught fragments of radio communication bleeding through the cabin's speaker system, voices using terminology that sounded more military than commercial aviation. The words were too brief and distorted to understand completely, but the tone carried urgency that contradicted Captain Rodriguez's earlier announcement about routine descent procedures. Behind her, she could feel the woman in 14C continuing to watch the landscape below, her attention focused with the kind of professional assessment that Jennifer had seen before in passengers whose civilian clothes couldn't quite hide their military bearing. Whatever was happening to their flight, whoever was managing their course changes from air traffic control, had just encountered someone who understood the situation far better than a typical passenger should. And that realization made Jennifer Walsh wonder if their Tuesday afternoon flight to Chicago had just become something significantly more complicated than routine commercial aviation. Captain Luis Rodriguez felt the Boeing 737's controls respond to his inputs with mechanical precision. But the radio communications in his headset carried information that challenged 28 years of commercial aviation experience. The vectors he was receiving from air traffic control directed his aircraft away from Chicago O'Hare and toward Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, a course change that required explanation to passengers and coordination with his airline's dispatch center. American 447, maintain heading 270, descend to flight level 240. The controller's voice carried authority that sounded more military than civilian air traffic management. "You are cleared for approach to Wright-Patterson. Emergency services are standing by." Rodriguez exchanged glances with his co-pilot, First Officer Amanda Chen, whose 12 years of commercial aviation had included emergency landings, medical diversions, and weather-related course changes. Neither of them had experience with military intercepts over domestic airspace, but the F-22 Raptors maintaining formation off their starboard wing made the situation's seriousness impossible to ignore. "Wright-Patterson Control, American 447, Rodriguez transmitted, his voice maintaining professional calm while his mind processed implications. "Requesting clarification on nature of emergency requiring military base landing." The response came from a different voice, one carrying the kind of authority that suggested direct communication from command-level personnel. "American 447, this is an operational security matter. Maintain current heading and prepare for standard approach procedures. You will be met by ground personnel upon landing." Operational security. Rodriguez had heard the term during his Air Force service 30 years earlier, before transitioning to commercial aviation and a career that rarely involved classified materials or situations requiring security clearances. The phrase suggested that someone aboard his aircraft represented a threat, possessed sensitive information, or warranted protection that exceeded normal civilian aviation protocols. "Lewis," First Officer Chen said quietly, monitoring their instruments while tracking the F-22s through the side window. "I've got a passenger requesting communication with the flight deck. Says it's regarding our current situation." Rodriguez felt his pulse accelerate. Passengers requesting direct communication with flight crew during emergencies usually meant medical situations, family crises, or occasionally, individuals with aviation expertise offering assistance. But given their military escort and course diversion, a passenger with information about their current situation suggested complications that his training hadn't addressed. "Which passenger?" he asked, beginning the approach checklist while maintaining visual contact with their military escort. Seat 14C Jennifer says the passenger appears to have military aviation background and has been tracking our flight path changes with unusual accuracy. The Boeing continued its descent toward Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, its commercial aviation systems interfacing with military air traffic control in ways that Rodriguez had practiced during emergency scenario training, but never experienced during actual flight operations. Through his headset, he could hear multiple frequencies coordinating their approach tower control, base operations, and encrypted channels that his radio couldn't decode, but could detect as background static. "Patch her through," Rodriguez decided, making a command decision that deviated from standard operating procedures but reflected the unusual circumstances of their situation. "If she has information that affects flight safety, I need to hear it." As his communication system connected him to passenger 14C, Captain Rodriguez found himself hoping that the woman's military background might provide context for the forces that had redirected his routine commercial flight into something that felt suspiciously like a classified operation. Because in his 3 decades of aviation experience, situations that began with military intercepts rarely ended with passengers simply collecting their luggage and continuing to their original destinations. And somehow, he suspected the woman in 14C understood that better than anyone else aboard American Airlines Flight 447. "Captain Thea, Revenant," Kowalski lifted the aircraft phone with hands that remembered the weight of flight controls during combat missions, her voice carrying the controlled calm that had earned her respect among pilots who measured competence in survival rates rather than civilian regulations. The commercial aircraft's communication system felt primitive compared to military avionics, but the principles remained identical. Clear communication could mean the difference between successful mission completion and catastrophic failure. "Captain Rodriguez, this is Captain Kowalski, United States Air Force Reserve," she said, using her military rank to establish credibility with the flight crew. "I need to inform you that our current situation extends beyond routine aviation emergency protocols." She could hear the subtle change in cockpit ambient sound that indicated the pilots were processing new information, weighing her words against their training and the unprecedented circumstances of their military escort. Through the passenger window, the F-22 Raptors maintained perfect formation, close enough that she could see pilot details through their canopies, far enough to avoid collision if the commercial aircraft encountered turbulence or needed evasive maneuvering. "Captain Kowalski, we're showing course vectors toward Wright-Patterson Air Force Base," Rodriguez replied, his voice reflecting the professional courtesy that military pilots extended to each other regardless of service branch or current duty status. "Can you provide additional context for our situation?" Thea measured her words carefully. The aircraft phone wasn't secured, and multiple agencies were undoubtedly monitoring their communication. But the civilian passengers and flight crew deserved enough information to understand that their safety depended on cooperation with military personnel who would meet them upon landing. "The intercept aircraft are F-22 Raptors operating under what appears to be classified mission parameters," she explained, watching the landscape below as farmland gave way to the sprawling infrastructure of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. "Our diversion suggests that someone aboard this aircraft is connected to sensitive military operations." "Someone aboard our aircraft?" Rodriguez's voice carried confusion mixed with growing concern. "We have a standard passenger manifest no one with security clearances or military transport authorization. Thea almost smiled at the irony. Her reservation had been made through civilian channels, her ticket purchased with a personal credit card for a routine flight to visit her sister in Chicago. The sophisticated intelligence apparatus that had identified her presence, tracked her movements, and coordinated today's intercept represented capabilities that she'd experienced from the operational side during classified missions overseas. "Captain, I believe the intercept is targeting me specifically," she said quietly, aware that her words were being recorded by aircraft systems and probably transmitted to ground-based command centers. "My military service included operations that remain classified at levels requiring specialized security protocols." The silence that followed her statement lasted long enough for her to watch the F-22s adjust their formation, as Wright-Patterson's runway complex became visible on the horizon. The airbase below represented one of America's most important aerospace research and development centers, home to classified projects that push the boundaries of aviation technology and military capabilities. "Ma'am, are you saying this intercept is connected to your service record?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality that pilots used when dealing with situations that exceeded their training or authorization levels. "That would be my assessment," Thea replied, then added words that carried implications she hoped the flight crew would understand. "I recommend full cooperation with ground personnel upon landing. This situation requires resolution through proper military channels." As she ended the communication and returned to her seat, Thea watched the F-22s begin their own approach pattern toward Wright-Patterson. The afternoon sunlight reflected off their stealth surfaces with angular precision, reminding her of her own combat aircraft and the missions that had earned her distinction, promotion, and apparently, enough attention to warrant today's elaborate intercept operation. 18 months after transitioning to reserve status, Captain Thea Kowalski had thought her war was over. But looking through the passenger window at military aircraft coordinating her forced landing, she realized that some battles simply changed venues rather than ending. Major Elena Vasquez watched the tactical display as 3 aircraft approached Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in perfect formation. 2 F-22 Raptors escorting a commercial Boeing 737, whose passenger manifest contained a name that had triggered the highest levels of operational security. The command center's main screen showed real-time satellite imagery of the approach, while secondary displays tracked radio communications, weather data, and the positioned response teams that would take custody of the situation upon landing. "Ma'am, we have confirmation from the intercept pilots," Technical Sergeant Morrison reported, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone witnessing operations that would never appear in official records. "The target has identified herself as military personnel and appears to understand the classified nature of the intercept." Vasquez studied intelligence reports that painted a picture of Captain Thea Kowalski's service record: 3 combat deployments, classified operations in Syria and Afghanistan, and a mission designated as Operation Nightfall that had officially never occurred. The woman had been presumed killed in action 18 months ago, her death carefully documented, and her classified knowledge considered permanently secured. Her reappearance aboard a commercial flight represented a security breach that threatened operations spanning 3 continents and involving assets whose existence required presidential authorization to discuss. The fact that she was alive meant that sensitive information had been compromised. The fact that she was traveling under her own name suggested either remarkable naivety or calculated provocation. "Status on ground reception?" Vasquez asked, monitoring the approach vectors as Wright-Patterson's tower guided the aircraft toward a runway that had been cleared of all routine traffic. "Security teams are in position," Morrison replied, coordinating with base personnel through encrypted channels. "Medical personnel standing by, and we have a secure debriefing facility prepared for immediate transfer upon landing." The F-22s peeled away from the commercial aircraft as it touched down on Wright-Patterson's main runway. their mission parameters complete with the delivery of their target to secure military custody. Through satellite imagery, Vasquez watched the Boeing 737 taxi toward a hangar complex that served as the arrival point for classified personnel and sensitive cargo. "Ma'am, we're receiving communication from the target," Morrison announced, his voice reflecting confusion about protocol for the unprecedented situation. "She's requesting direct contact with operational command." Vasquez felt her pulse quicken. Military personnel trained in classified operations understood chain of command protocols that prevented direct communication with tactical commanders, except under extraordinary circumstances. The fact that Captain Kowalski was requesting such contact suggested either desperation or information that warranted immediate attention from decision-makers. "Patch her through," Vasquez ordered, making a command decision that deviated from established security protocols. "Priority channel, full encryption, record everything." As the communication systems connected her to a woman who had been officially dead for 18 months, Major Alina Vasquez found herself hopping that the intelligence reports about Operation Nightfall had been incomplete rather than compromised. Because if Captain Thea Kowalski really had survived the mission that officially never happened, her knowledge represented either an unprecedented security threat or an opportunity to resolve questions that had haunted classified operations for over a year. The distinction between those possibilities would determine whether today's intercept marked the end of a security crisis or the beginning of something far more dangerous. Captain Thea, Revenant, Kowalski stepped off American Airlines Flight 447 onto the tarmac of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, her civilian clothes a stark contrast to the military precision surrounding her arrival. The hangar complex buzzed with activity as security personnel, intelligence officers, and base operations coordinated a reception that looked more like a high-value prisoner transfer than a routine aircraft diversion. The September afternoon air carried the familiar sounds of military aviation: jet engines spooling down, ground crews securing aircraft, and the controlled communications of personnel managing classified operations. For Thea, the environment felt like returning home after an extended deployment, except that home now treated her as a potential threat rather than a decorated combat veteran. Captain Kowalski, a woman in Air Force utility uniform, approached with credentials that identified her as Major Alina Vasquez, Intelligence Services. "I'm the tactical commander for today's operation. We need to discuss your current situation immediately." Thea assessed the major with eyes trained to read military bearing, stress indicators, and the subtle signs that distinguished competent officers from those promoted beyond their capabilities. Vasquez carried herself with confidence earned through operational experience rather than administrative advancement, and her direct approach suggested someone comfortable making decisions under pressure. "Major, I assume this intercept relates to classified operations from my previous deployment," Thea replied, allowing security personnel to escort them toward a facility that bore no external markings but radiated the institutional authority of sensitive military installations. "I'm prepared to cooperate fully with whatever debriefing protocol you deem necessary." They walked across tarmac that seemed to stretch endlessly under afternoon sunlight, passing aircraft that represented the cutting edge of American aerospace technology. F-22 Raptors, experimental prototypes whose designations remained classified, and transport aircraft configured for missions that would never appear on official flight schedules. Wright-Patterson served as a nexus where military aviation pushed the boundaries of physics, engineering, and tactical capability. "Captain, our intelligence indicates that you possess information about Operation Nightfall," Vasquez said as they approached the secure facility. "That operation was classified at levels requiring presidential authorization to discuss." Thea felt familiar weight settling across her shoulders, the burden of carrying secrets that affected national security, tactical operations, and the safety of personnel whose names would never appear on memorial walls if they died during classified missions. Operation Nightfall had been designed to remain buried, its participants reassigned, and its objectives achieved through methods that couldn't survive public scrutiny. Major, I need to clarify something immediately, Thea said, stopping before they entered the facility. Operation Nightfall wasn't just classified, it was compromised. The intelligence that led to today's intercept operation is based on incomplete information. The security personnel surrounding them represented the kind of specialized units that handled situations requiring both technical expertise and absolute discretion. Their equipment, communications gear, and coordinated movement patterns suggested training for scenarios that exceeded routine base security protocols. Compromised how? Vasquez asked, her voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone processing tactical information that could affect ongoing operations. Thea measured her words, aware that the next few minutes would determine whether she was treated as an intelligence asset or a security threat. The afternoon sunlight felt warm against her face, reminding her of Syrian desert operations where decisions made in seconds determined mission success or